Hello, my name is Ryan Stevens. I'm the Director of Engineering at LendingClub. I'd love to tell you a little about the company I work for. LendingClub is the world's largest online lending marketplace where we connect borrowers and sellers and borrowers and investors on our platform. To date, we've facilitated over $13 billion in loans. What framework do you use? That's a really common question I get a lot in the industry. I'm perfectly happy to work through the design decisions that I or my team have made with people. But I've noticed the frequency of being asked this has dramatically increased in the years. And I find myself wondering, why is this such a common question? Almost to the point it's an icebreaker in our community. So when I tell people, though, yeah, we've rolled our own, but it's not as bad as you think, I get a broad array of emotional responses. Three common ones are excitement, yeah, me too, to anger, why would you do that? Oh, I'm done with this interaction, to fear and confusion, which usually sounds like, haven't you heard of this framework? Or why don't you use that framework? When you dig deeper in those conversations, I found some people, not all, are fearful that they have chosen the wrong framework to invest in. It's as if they are deathly paralyzed that they might have gotten on the wrong horse. I've crafted this talk to not really discuss the how-tos of building a framework, but really explore the why someone would want to build a framework and look at the benefits that come to developers and their team. But first, I want to do a real quick experiment. I want you to think of the framework that you use in your head, and then on three, we're all going to say the framework we use. Ready? 1, 2, 3. WordPress. What? Oh, sorry. Cue the other deck. All right. So there's a reason why we all probably said something different. As a community, as an industry, especially in the front end and Node.js, I really feel that is there really a single definition? People view frameworks for different reasons, that have different sizes of those frameworks, and that's just something that, as a community, we've wrestled with over the years. I know I've somewhat changed my idea of what a framework is. If I were to look at kind of my experiences throughout my career and measure the complexity I like to hold solutions over my time, I kind of started here. I discovered jQuery. This is before mainstream frameworks were really even a thing, at least out in the open. And in this example, you click something, and I updated DOM element. This is really interesting to me because I finally found JavaScript and something that allowed me to change something in the DOM really quickly. But then as I progressed, mainstream frameworks such as Backbone hit, and I found Backbone. I was really excited about this. I said, yes, I can finally have an organization for some of the patterns I've been using over and over again. So in the same example, doing the same exact functionality, I have a model and a view, and the model updates the view. Great. But then after a while, as I started to grow as an engineer, I wanted to tackle the idea of what if I were to create my own framework? And so I created this abstraction over Backbone. It was really interesting because it had a DSL. It did fancy things like isomorphic JavaScript. But I learned a lot in this process. But I kind of got over that, and Node.js started to really influence my code. And I said, I don't really need a framework. That's just a lot of stuff to do, very little. So with Browser River, I started doing more Node-style development on the front end and started drinking more of the functional Kool-Aid. So although all these things do the same thing, the complexity of my code started to change. But then I got over that. I was like, what am I doing? What if I just use inline JavaScript just to solve the same problem? Done. That's a joke, kind of, not really. All right, so are we there yet? Wouldn't it be great as an industry if we were to converge onto one framework, onto one abstraction, and one way to do things, that we can all get on that same horse and create value for us? So as I started to answer this question, I kind of worked through the last 10 years, and this is to my perception, and I started measuring things from frameworks to all the way down to modules. And so in 2005, ASP.NET was the thing. So I'm just going to start there. This is by no means exhaustive, as so much as how I perceived how we've been progressing. The dot size is really measuring the total weight of the solution, the total weight of the framework. So as we progressed into 2005, 2007, prototype and jQuery hit. Those weren't frameworks, so I'm not registering them on the framework scale, but they were things that helped us create big, complex programs. YUI, DWT were much more allowed us to create more classic framework code. But as we went into 2010, we started seeing the mainstream MVC frameworks such as Sprout Core, Ember, Angular. Those actually hit in 2010, which is easy to forget because we still somewhat think of those are relevant things, relevant frameworks. But then in 2011-ish, Thomas Fuchs did something really interesting in the community. He put out a site called Micro.js. Micro.js was really just a collection of small modules that were under 5K. I don't even think we called them modules back then. Just a collection of small libraries, really. And I got really excited about this because I saw, yes, instead of going towards these large monolithic frameworks, we're going to be able to compose just exactly what we need. So what Micro.js really did, though, is it started to really pull together and highlight all the things that have been floating out there that were much smaller in our ecosystem. And over time, we started with really Node influence and started building smaller things. Eventually, React and Flux hit. And those are interesting because from day one, React has always said it's just the view layer. It's not a framework. People insisted that it was a framework, insisted on thinking it was a framework. So Flux hit, but even that is just a design pattern. So we started building ecosystems around all of these mainstream frameworks. But really, I've noticed that the frameworks itself started keeping on rolling in the terms of the quantity. Another thing I've also noticed is the mainstream frameworks started to iterate. They got bigger. They got more features, more ideas put into them. But they learned to manage their complexity by composing themselves of smaller pieces that either they created. So in this example, Ember created handlebars, or they're definitely coupled together. However, both stand alone in isolation and can be worked. So what does this all mean? Josiah Sparks recently blogged that JavaScript is ephemeral, and I like to kind of extend that to say frameworks are ephemeral. We can see this in evidence of just that sheer number of frameworks that I've been perceiving through our industry. The cadence of developers announcing they've affixed some programming paradigm on a regular basis, this contributes to that flavor of the week joke that we always hear, one framework after another, just wait around and there'll be something you'll like. And to me, it's all very exhausting. I'm not offering this as evidence. Choosing a mainstream open source framework is wrong, counterproductive, or bad in any way. Only choosing the right framework is not an absolute indicator of project success. Once we embrace the idea we have not arrived, and quite possibly never will, to that single design pattern, I really believe the value proposition of rolling your own framework can be built on equal footing. So why create your own framework? Going back to the original question, there's always technical reasons, and these reasons are very subjective. In some ways, you can measure them. You can have endless arguments with people and your peers about those. But I'm not really going to go tit for tat with each one of these and talk too much about each specifics, as so much as just explore some of the softer sides and benefits of creating a framework. Because I wanted to. This is definitely the polar opposite of those technical reasons I just flashed. This is probably the most subjective thing I can say. But really, when you ask somebody why they created a framework, or when they ask me, it will come down to because I wanted to, and you start unpacking that. I really think it's because they're having fun. They wanted to do it because they're growing as an engineer. And so this leads into something that I think at developer joy, we discredit and we discount far too often. And we don't necessarily celebrate developer joy as a vehicle to grow and really iterate ourselves and our code at the same time. And so another reason, because you can. Let me explain that. So at LendingClub, we created our own framework, internal to us, called Zephyr. But what we didn't do is we didn't necessarily reinvent that wheel where I'm always accused of when I tell people I created my own framework. I so much as saw some modules that other frameworks were using, use jQuery. Pick some other modules from other frameworks and other loosely coupled things laying around, and we simply compose that into a solution that works for us. At LendingClub, we really aren't afraid to own that framework and put what I view as domain-specific modules into that framework, so modules that are specific to us, that work just for us. And because we're the only ones that really have stake at it, that's OK. So another reason people roll their own framework is because you probably already are building one. So let me explain that. A traditional application framework lets you put features and bolt them right on top in building blocks. That's its job. And as you need more features, that framework somewhat scales. But the second you go outside that bounds of that framework, most developers are actually pretty smart. And they're going to simply create and extend features. And they're going to work through their limitations of that framework. And that's fine. And they'll put on more features. But over time, developers will create abstractions, create shims, and create APIs. And that's exactly what we did at LendingClub. And over time, we created that light blue area. That's what I more view as the Zephyr framework. Zephyr framework. And as we embraced that, some of those features really were more dried up back to that framework level. Another aspect of this is, at LendingClub, we consciously make a trade-off in our Node.js runtime into our build time. And so that allows us to not worry so much about a lot of frameworks concerns, but to push them out into that build through Zephyr, through Gulp and Browserify. We also use a framework called Cartero that works for us. But because we're kind of making those complexity trade-offs, it really does allow us to thin out our runtime. We use Yeoman, which is another way of also training complexities. Instead of having our Node.js runtime enforce everything at runtime, we assume certain conventions, certain aspects of the setup of the project configuration are all just right. And so we use Yeoman to help with that. On the Node.js runtime, we did centralize around handlebars, and we also run Cartera and Express. And this is one interesting aspect that I always get, and people accuse me first, well, you didn't make your own framework, you used an Express. But really, I've never once said we need to reinvent the whole wheel, as so much use components out there and drive those up over time into something that works for us. We also really believe in this aspect of isomorphic or universal JavaScript. So every single module that we use in Node.js can also be reused on the browser. And so it's across all three boundaries that we consider our framework to be Zephyr, not just the node, not just the build time, and not just the front end. And this allows us to really make coupled decisions with each boundary in a loosely coupled way. So what I mean by that is each side can assume the other side is doing its part in that framework decision and make those assumptions. But each vertical can be created and developed and stand alone on their own. So one realization that we've had is custom frameworks can transcend those traditional boundaries. So looking at those boundaries, one big design decision that we built into Zephyr is that it can empower multiple teams, not just one team, but multiple teams using this framework. And so as each team uses a framework, it would be, one aspect is that a framework's job is to enforce best practices, dry up code, and create a healthy dev workflow. That's exactly what I just got done talking through. But one aspect that we're really careful about is when you do that, where you create a framework team and they give those product teams the code and the framework, it really could feel top down. This is where you get those ivory castles that people kind of are so guarded against. And it will end up dictating those paradigms for teams to adopt. So what we do is, in a very conscious level, is we try to create a more project-centric way to create our framework. So let me explain that. So as each project uses Zephyr, those application build blocks, so they're just going to look differently because they're different applications. But as we get an idea that could be a framework-oriented idea, we're actually not quick to put those first into Zephyr and our internal framework. We're quick to put them into our project. And then just try it out. Just iterate on those ideas and let it bake a little. And then as we get an idea that another team wants, we're actually OK with a little copy and pasting. I'm OK with two teams experimenting, because what that's going to do is going to create two different competing ideas that are going to iterate over time together. And as ideas start to bake out, we'll promote those up into the framework level. And one nice aspect about this, when you have those boundaries and those different areas, that gives people kind of a place to hang their hat that they're excited about growing into, rather than just a Node.js runtime. Sometimes ideas aren't so great, so we'll just allow those just to remain in the project they were created. And as each project takes a new version of the framework, one really exciting thing that we've seen happens is because the developers built parts of Zephyr as they built their projects, they're quick to accept those new versions and version bump and then refactor in an aggressive fashion. So even though we're very quick to publish breaking API changes, we're also very quick to accept those throughout the product teams because they're the ones building the framework. So what this really does is has really great benefits is over time, you get to harden APIs rather than guess at APIs in the framework level and hope you're right. And I would actually champion that best practices are, by definition, defined by the team writing the code. And so when you have a team that's creating a framework that its job is to embody best practices, it's just much better and builds a much healthier culture in your team to allow those to come from the framework, come from the product and into the framework. So one thing that we've seen is framework requirements should organically emerge from the team. So where do I start? I always say start by looking at your team. So these are the people I have the privilege of working with every day at LendingClub. If I were to take them and kind of graph them on that same chart that I went through, this is random. This doesn't actually reflect people's skills, to illustrate a point. But some people on the team are going to live in a more complex environment. They're going to want, and they're going to be hungry to create something interesting and something unique. Other people are going to be new to the team, and they're not necessarily going to be as in tune with owning that. But one really interesting aspect that I wanted to bring up is, as you have a very diverse team from many backgrounds of skill and experience, I wanted to talk about how new JavaScript programmers in that, we'll look at JS-HTTP. That's a collection of modules that actually isn't a framework at all. It allows you to create an HTTP framework really quickly by composing your own modules. And Meteor is kind of the kitchen sink of everything in our community. And so a new JavaScript programmer is going to approach JS-HTTP and say, wow, that's really interesting, but I don't really know how to use it. Whereas Meteor, they're going to approach us and get really excited. They're going to see Meteor and say, yes, I get that. There's documentation. There's a way to do everything. I can be productive right away. But if you take an expert JavaScript programmer on your team and show them those two solutions, they're going to look at JS-HTTP and Meteor, and their lens of which you're looking at both solutions are going to be completely the opposite. They're going to look at JS-HTTP and say, oh, wow, that's amazing. I can finally take exactly what I want and rearrange them exactly how I need them and not necessarily rely on Express. And then they're going to look at Meteor, and they're going to think it might be interesting, but they're going to crack that hood, as in they're going to start reading the source code. And they're going to agree with a lot of design decisions Meteor has, but they're also going to really disagree because that's what we do as engineers. And so that's just one aspect that I wanted to kind of highlight, that when we're working with each other and creating a framework as a team, having a level of empathy really helps approach complementing each other on that team. And so as people kind of grow into complexity, and some people kind of grow out of that complexity, keeping that empathy is really important. That it creates, I feel, a culture of mentorship and a culture where people are excited to grow into roles as they advance in their career and their skill set and want to take on a little more complexity. And it's also important to have an empathy if you are on that expert level, that you're not creating these abstractions that are so hard to adopt and maintain by the rest of your team. At the end of the day, though, I really champion that creating a framework is an exercise in team ownership. As a team, you can create something. You can mentor others to grow into that. And then you can own it and maintain it long term together, and then iterate it together. So I'd like to leave in my final part, where are you in your JavaScript journey? So if you're in the place where you're excited to take on something, excited to learn, I actually think creating a framework, whether you use it at your company or open source it or not, that's actually a very healthy thing to do to help you grow. But more importantly, look at your team. Are you at a team that would be excited and seeing some of these benefits being realized? I would, if you are, creating a framework is something that I feel good about, and I feel good about at LendingClub and working with my team, and so could you. Thank you. Questions? None? All right, good.
We have separate teams working on the same framework, but they're all kind of issues where there's a lot of great things that are being created, but other teams are having discovery issues.
Yeah, we do. So that's actually something where, so the question was, if there's a bunch of teams working on the same things, are there issues where there's, let's say, duplication of effort? And I actually think we are so quickly to optimize not duplicating effort, we forget to look at that other lens of people growing and trying things out. And so I'm never afraid to let a couple teams try the same idea out. And then if they're learning, if they're excited to iterate together for one common goal. The key is that last part is to make gluing together conversations at the right point so there's not a complete waste of effort. So, any other questions? Okay, thank you.